Imagine the wind howling across a sea of pale grass, cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs. The landscape is vast, beautiful, and utterly merciless. History remembers him as a monster, a god of war who painted continents in blood, erased entire civilizations, and built an empire so massive it stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the heart of Europe. His name alone would eventually make kings tremble on their thrones. But before he was Genghis Khan, before he commanded the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen, he was just a boy named Temujin. And his story begins not in a palace of gold, but in the freezing dirt, hunted, starving, and entirely alone. The legend of the steppe says he came into this brutal world with his tiny fist clenched tight. When his mother, Holin, pried his fingers apart, she found a solid, black clot of blood resting in his palm. On the unforgiving Mongolian plains, where life was cheap and death was always one harsh winter away, the shamans and elders saw this as a dark omen. This child, they whispered,
The spirits whisper of Temujin.
A great leader or a curse.
We must protect him.
The burden is ours.
The signs are clear.
He will bring storms. We must prepare.
The prophecy awakens.
was destined for endless slaughter. Destiny, however, is a luxury the poor cannot afford. For young Temujin, survival was the only reality he knew. His childhood shattered before he even reached his 10th birthday. His father, Yasuge, was a minor tribal chieftain, a proud, fierce warrior. But on the steppe, pride often breeds enemies. While traveling home one evening, Yasuge crossed paths with a rival tribe, the Tatars. Under the sacred, unspoken rules of nomadic hospitality, they offered him a meal. But the food was laced with a slow-acting poison. Yasuge made it back to his camp just in time to die in agony. Suddenly, the title of chieftain fell to a 9-year-old boy. But the steppe has absolutely no mercy for weakness. The warriors of his father's tribe refused to be commanded by a child. In the dead of night, they packed up their felt tents, rounded up the herds of horses and sheep, and rode away. They took the food. They took the protection. They left Temujin, his mother, and his younger siblings behind to starve in the wilderness. Imagine the sheer, suffocating terror. Winter in Mongolia routinely plunges to 40 degrees below zero. To be without a tribe was a death sentence. Temujin's mother was a woman of terrifying resilience. Refusing to let her children perish, she spent her days frantically digging up roots, scavenging wild berries, and hunting field mice. Temujin watched his mother's hands bleed as she clawed at the frozen, unyielding earth just to keep them breathing for one more day. In the freezing darkness of their isolated tent, watching his family shiver and waste away, Temujin learned his first, most defining psychological lesson. Loyalty is an illusion. The world is a predator, and you must decide whether you will be the wolf or the sheep. Starvation breeds desperation, and desperation breeds violence. Inside their fractured family, a dark power struggle emerged. Temujin's older half-brother, Bektar, began hoarding what little food they caught, physically dominating him and asserting himself as the new patriarch. But the trauma of abandonment had forged something cold and unbreakable inside Temujin. He refused to be a victim in his own home. In a moment that would foreshadow the ruthless pragmatism of his future empire, Temujin and his younger brother Kasar quietly stalked Bektar through the tall grass, cornering him on a desolate, wind-swept hill. Realizing he was trapped, Bektar didn't fight back. He only asked that they spare his blood brother. Without a single word, without a flicker of hesitation, Temujin drew his bow and shot his own half-brother dead. It was his first kill. He walked back to camp that day, not as a boy, but as the apex predator of his family. Yet, the steppe was not finished breaking him. Word of the murder eventually reached the very tribe that had abandoned them years ago. Fearing the boy was growing too dangerous, they sent a heavily armed raiding party. They captured the teenager, and, to strip him of his humanity, locked a heavy wooden collar, a conch, around his neck. It was a torturous device that prevented him from feeding himself or resting his head. For months, the future conqueror of the world was dragged through the dirt from camp to camp, mocked, beaten, and spat on. But his captors fundamentally underestimated the fire burning behind his eyes. One night, during a raucous tribal festival, the camp guards grew drunk and lazy. Temujin saw his window. He swung the heavy wooden collar like a club, smashing it into the skull of his captor, and bolted into the pitch-black wilderness. Desperate, he waded into the freezing currents of the Onan River, submerging his entire body in the icy water, leaving only his nose exposed to the night air. He stayed there, shivering in the black water, as his hunters combed the riverbanks with torches, inches away from discovering him. He survived that night, and when he finally managed to break the wooden collar off his bruised, bleeding neck, something inside his soul locked into place. The scared, starving boy was gone. Looking out across the vast, endless horizon, Temujin realized a terrifying truth. As long as the tribes of the steppe remained divided, tearing each other apart in endless cycles of betrayal, boys like him would always be hunted. He didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted control. When Temujin stepped out of the freezing waters of the Onan River, he had no army, no horses, and no wealth. But he carried a weapon far more dangerous than any sword. A mind completely unburdened by the traditions that had kept the steppe divided for centuries. Because he had been treated like garbage by the nobility, Temujin fundamentally rejected the old world order. In the rigid hierarchy of the Mongolian plains, your worth was determined entirely by your bloodline. But Temujin realized that a man's pedigree didn't matter when a blade was at his throat. He began to gather a small, intensely loyal following of outcasts, runaway slaves, and masterless warriors. To him, loyalty and competence were the only currencies that mattered. It was a radical, incredibly dangerous idea. But to build a future, he first had to reclaim his past. Years prior, he had been betrothed to a young girl named Bort. Honoring that old promise, he tracked her down. Remarkably, her family still accepted the union, and for a fleeting moment, Temujin experienced something he hadn't known since he was 9 years old: happiness. Borta became his anchor and the emotional core of his life. But peace on the steppe is only ever an illusion. In the dead of night, the thundering hooves of 300 Merkit warriors shattered the silence of their camp, a revenge raid for a generations-old grudge against Temujin's father. Caught completely off guard, Temujin and his men barely escaped into the mountains. As dawn broke, he looked down from the high ridges and realized the agonizing truth. Borta was gone. She had been dragged away as a prize of war. For a traditional steppe nomad, you mourned, you moved on, and you survived. But Temujin refused to be the helpless boy watching his family be destroyed again. He didn't just want his wife back. He wanted to absolutely crush the men who took her. He swallowed his pride and sought out two powerful warlords: his father's old ally, Togrul, and a charismatic young leader named Jamuka. Jamuka wasn't just a warlord. He was Temujin's Anda, his childhood blood brother. They had sworn an oath as young boys to be fiercely loyal to one another for eternity. Moved by his plea, they amassed a massive army and rode out. The raid on the Merkit camp was a masterclass in calculated terror. Temujin tore through the enemy tents, frantically screaming Borta's name into the chaos. From the back of a stolen cart, a woman leapt down, running toward his voice. In the flickering firelight, He recognized her face. He had won her back. But the victory came with a crushing complication. Borta was heavily pregnant. In a society obsessed with bloodlines, the birth of a child fathered by an enemy captor was an unpardonable shame. Most chieftains would have cast the child out. But when the boy was born, Temujin made a decision that profoundly shocked his followers and cemented his legendary psychological strength. He named the boy Yochi, which translates to the guest. He recognized Yoki as his own flesh and blood, raised him as his eldest son, and fiercely protected Borta's honor. Temujin chose the family he built over the expectations of society. Riding high on this victory, Temujin and his blood brother Jamuka combined their tribes. For a year and a half, they shared the same camp and led as equals. But two alpha wolves cannot share a single mountain. A quiet, psychological war began to brew. Jamuka was an aristocrat to his core, treating common herdsmen as expendable pawns. Temujin, however, promoted men based on their skill. If a lowly shepherd was a genius with a bow, Temujin made him a commander. The breaking point arrived silently. One morning, Jamuka sent a coded, dismissive message to Temujin, essentially telling him to take his commoners and set up camp elsewhere. Borta, sensing the danger, told her husband the hard truth. Jamuka has grown tired of you. We must leave now. Under the cover of night, the camp literally split in two. When the sun rose, Jamuka was stunned. Thousands of his own warriors and herdsmen had abandoned him to follow Temujin. They chose the meritocracy. They chose the future. With this new army, Temujin revolutionized steppe warfare. He dismantled the old tribal system, organizing warriors into squads regardless of family origins. He instituted a revolutionary law: no looting until the battle was completely won, and spoils would be divided equally, with special shares guaranteed for widows and orphans. He was building a machine fueled by absolute, fanatical devotion. Across the plains, Jamuka watched his blood brother's terrifying rise with growing fury. He realized Temujin was an existential threat to the aristocratic order of the world. Gathering an enormous coalition of rival tribes, Jamuka prepared to drown Temujin's radical dream in blood. The wind screamed across the desolate plains of Dalan Baljut as Temujin stood at the head of his heavily outnumbered army. Over 30,000 warriors thundered toward him. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a desperate fight for survival. And on that blood-soaked afternoon, the old world won. Temujin's revolutionary tactics fractured under the overwhelming mass of Jamuka's forces. Forced into a brutal retreat, Temujin fled into the rugged Jareen Gorge. He had survived, but what followed was a nightmare that would permanently alter his psychology. To send a horrifying message to the steppe, Jamuka captured several of Temujin's generals. He didn't execute them swiftly. Instead, he ordered 70 massive iron cauldrons to be hauled onto the battlefield, filled with water and brought to a rolling boil. While Temujin was trapped in the gorge, utterly helpless, he received word of what his blood brother had done. Jamuka boiled Temujin's captive generals alive. It was an act of savagery so grotesque, it shocked the entire steppe. For Temujin, sitting in the cold darkness of his retreat, the news was a psychological breaking point. The boy who had fought to rescue his wife died in that gorge. The man who walked out was entirely devoid of mercy. Jamuka had taught him a terrible lesson. Half measures only get your friends boiled alive. If you want to survive, you must annihilate your enemies. For the next 10 years, Temujin waged a terrifying war of absolute subjugation. When he finally cornered the Tatars, the tribe that had poisoned his father, he didn't just demand their surrender. He ordered his men to measure every captive Tatar male against the linchpin of a wagon wheel. Any male taller than the pin was systematically executed. He absorbed the remaining women and children into his own ranks, completely wiping the Tatar identity from the face of the earth. He was engineering a new society. When you were conquered by Temujin, your tribe ceased to exist. His absolute genius for psychological warfare made him unstoppable. When his forces besieged the heavily fortified city of Volohai and couldn't breach the stone walls, Temujin offered a bizarre peace treaty. He promised to lift the siege, asking only for a strange tribute: 1,000 cats and 10,000 swallows. The bewildered city leaders handed the animals over. Temujin then ordered his soldiers to tie small tufts of wool to their tails and set the wool on fire. Panicked and burning, the birds flew back to their nests in the thatched roofs, and the cats squeezed into the wooden barns. Within minutes, the city erupted into an uncontrollable inferno. In the ensuing chaos, Temujin's forces breached the gates and slaughtered the defenders. He was evolving into an entity of pure, calculating devastation. But there was still one final ghost he had to exorcise. By 1206, Temujin had unified nearly every tribe on the steppe, hunting Jamuka into total isolation. Stripped of his armies, Jamuka was eventually betrayed by his own remaining guards, who dragged him in chains to Temujin's camp, hoping for a reward. Temujin's response was immediate. He executed the guards on the spot for betraying their rightful lord. Then, he stood face to face with Jamuka. Decades of history, love, betrayal, and unspeakable violence hung in the air. Temujin offered his childhood friend a chance to stand by his side again. But Jamuka refused. "There can only be one sun in the sky," Jamuka said, "and there can be only one lord of the steppe. Give me a noble death." Honoring his final wish, Temujin ordered Jamuka's execution without the shedding of blood. His back was broken. With his final rival dead, Temujin returned to the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. A massive assembly of the newly unified tribes, now known as the Mongols, gathered to recognize the unimaginable. A starving, abandoned boy had conquered their entire world. The shamans granted him a new, terrifying title, one that meant universal ruler: Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan! Genghis Khan! Genghis Khan! Genghis Khan!
He had united the steppe. But as he looked toward the glittering, wealthy empires of China and the Middle East, he realized a deeply unsettling truth. His massive war machine was fueled entirely by momentum. To keep the peace at home, he had to set the rest of the world on fire. The Mongol war machine was a terrifying paradox. Born out of a desperate desire for peace on the steppe, it now required endless war to survive. He had forged an alliance of starving wolves, and now he had to feed them. He turned his gaze toward the impossibly wealthy Jin dynasty of China. The Jin emperors sat behind towering stone walls, believing their fortresses were impenetrable. Genghis didn't just breach their walls, he starved their cities, diverted their rivers, and captured their finest engineers, turning the empire's own advanced siege technology against it. But the true apex of his wrath was unleashed on the Middle East, triggered by a fatal miscalculation. Genghis had sent a peaceful trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling Islamic superpower. The arrogant border governor seized the goods and slaughtered the Mongol ambassadors. When Genghis received the news, he went to the top of his sacred mountain, unfastened his belt in a show of total submission to the heavens, and prayed for 3 days. When he descended, his verdict was absolute. What followed was not a war. It was an apocalyptic event. Genghis Khan swept into the Middle East with a fury that permanently altered human history. When the great city of Urgench refused to yield, the Mongols diverted the mighty Amu Darya River, entirely submerging the city and wiping its foundations from the map. Libraries were burned. Grand mosques were reduced to rubble. It is said that the rivers ran black with the ink of 1,000 years of scholarship, and red with the blood of millions. Genghis Khan used terror as a psychological scalpel. If a city surrendered immediately, it was spared, taxed, and its religious freedoms protected. If it resisted for even a day, every inhabitant was slaughtered, their skulls piled into massive, rotting pyramids outside the ruined gates, a grisly advertisement to the next city on the map. But as the years bled into decades, the man who conquered the earth faced the one truth all gods of war eventually confront. He was running out of time. In his 60s, Genghis Khan was no longer the boy shivering in the freezing waters. He was a tired, aging patriarch, carrying the crushing weight of an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His closest friends were dead. His beloved wife, Burta, his anchor to his own humanity, passed away. Fearing the collapse of everything he had built, he summoned an ancient, highly revered Taoist monk named Changchen from China. Genghis desperately asked the monk for the elixir of eternal life. The old monk looked at the most dangerous man in human history and delivered a quiet, crushing truth. "There are ways to prolong life," the monk softly said, "but there is no medicine for immortality." The universal ruler was going to die. In the winter of 1227, during a brutal campaign against the rebelling Tongan people, the aging Khan's horse reared, throwing the old conqueror violently to the freezing ground. He suffered massive internal injuries. His generals begged him to return home and heal. But the mind of Genghis Khan was still trapped in the survival instincts of his childhood. Refusing to show weakness, he ordered the campaign to continue from his sickbed. Knowing the end was near, he summoned his sons. He forced them to swear an oath of unity, knowing his blood-soaked empire could easily drown itself if they fought for the throne. Then, he issued his final, chilling military order, the complete and utter eradication of the Tangut people who had dared to rebel. And then, the man who had shaken the world simply closed his eyes. What followed was the most heavily guarded secret in human history. To ensure his grave would never be desecrated, his loyal guards placed his body in a simple wooden cart and began the long journey back to the sacred mountains of Mongolia. The heavily armed escort slaughtered every single human, bird, and beast that crossed their path, ensuring there were no witnesses. When they laid him in the earth, they ordered 1,000 horses to trample the ground until every trace of the grave was erased. To this day, the resting place of Genghis Khan remains entirely undiscovered. History is left to grapple with a ghost of terrifying contradictions. He was a ruthless butcher who erased entire civilizations, yet he created the modern world. He instituted universal religious freedom, created the first international postal system, established diplomatic immunity, and connected the East and the West, birthing the Silk Road that would pull Europe out of the Dark Ages. He was a man who trusted no one, yet built an empire on absolute loyalty. He was an outcast who became a king, and today, 1 in every 200 men alive carries his genetic code. He was born with a black clot of blood clutched in his tiny fist, and he left the world drowning in it. But perhaps the greatest, most haunting truth of Genghis Khan is not the scale of his destruction, but the profound silence of his exit. He conquered the entire world, but in the end, all he took for himself was an unmarked patch of dirt beneath the eternal blue sky.